The emergency room was buzzing with activity. Nurses rushed back and forth, and doctors hurried to attend to their patients. But in the corner of the waiting room, something unusual was happening. A homeless man, dressed in tattered clothes, was sitting on one of the chairs. His face was pale, his hands shaking, and his breathing seemed shallow. He looked desperately in need of help. But as he waited, something unexpected occurred. Dr. Simon Pierce, a well-known and respected physician in the hospital, approached him with a cold, indifferent look on his face. The man looked up at him, his eyes pleading for assistance. "I'm sorry," Dr. Pierce said, without a hint of emotion in his voice. "You'll need to find care elsewhere." The homeless man blinked, confused. "But I'm sick, please." Dr. Pierce turned away without another word, leaving the man sitting there, stunned. The room seemed to quiet for a moment as the other patients and staff looked on. It was almost as if time had stopped. Why would a doctor refuse to help someone in need? And what could have led him to make such a decision? The moment Dr. Pierce walked away, the room seemed to fill with a strange silence. Nurses exchanged puzzled glances, and a few doctors raised their eyebrows. Everyone knew Dr. Pierce to be a professional, someone who cared deeply about his patients. Yet, what had just happened was unlike anything they'd ever seen. One nurse, Clara, leaned toward her colleague, whispering, "Did you see that? He didn't even check on the guy, just turned him away." Another nurse, Mark, nodded in disbelief. "I thought Dr. Pierce was one of the best. He's always so kind." The homeless man, still sitting in the waiting area, seemed lost in his thoughts. He wasn't angry, but his confusion was evident. He clutched his stomach, clearly in pain, but didn't speak up again. He simply waited. The hospital staff had seen their fair share of difficult situations, but this was something else. A doctor refusing to treat a patient who was clearly unwell? That was unheard of. Dr. Pierce's actions didn't make sense to them. Nurses began to whisper among themselves, exchanging theories. Some tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was some kind of medical emergency he had to deal with that took priority. But even so, the coldness of the doctor's words felt wrong. One of the doctors, Sarah, approached Dr. Pierce, who was busy going through some files at his desk. "Dr. Pierce, I just saw what happened in the waiting room. That man needs help. Why didn't you?" Dr. Pierce didn't look up from his paperwork. "I can't help everyone, Sarah. It's complicated." Word of the doctor's refusal spread quickly. The next morning, a local news outlet reported the incident, and before long it was all over social media. Headlines screamed, "Doctor refuses to treat homeless man. Why?" And a shocking decision, doctor turns away a sick patient. As the story gained traction, people were shocked and outraged. Comments flooded in, some demanding answers, others expressing disgust at the doctor's actions. Some even went so far as to call for Dr. Pierce's license to be revoked. "I can't believe this," one person commented. "How can a doctor refuse to help a person in need? This is beyond heartless." Another person posted, "There must be more to this. Doctors take an oath to help. What's going on?" The homeless man, now identified as Charlie, was suddenly at the center of attention. People sympathized with him, but they also wanted to know more. What had happened? Why was he there? Why did the doctor refuse to treat him? While some stood by Dr. Pierce, defending him as a man who had earned his place in the medical field, the majority were appalled. The controversy was escalating quickly. Journalists rushed to interview bystanders who had witnessed the interaction in the waiting room. One woman said, "I saw it with my own eyes. It was so cold. The doctor didn't even take a second to look at the man. I don't know how anyone could do that." The situation was a topic of heated debate in every corner of the city. People in coffee shops, on buses, and at work were talking about it. Everyone was asking the same question. Why? In the midst of all this, Dr. Pierce remained silent. He wasn't commenting on the incident, not even to those who worked with him. His refusal to speak only added fuel to the fire, and the community grew more impatient, wanting to understand what had led to such a harsh decision. As the public outcry continued, the media dug deeper. Everyone wanted to understand why Dr. Simon Pierce, a respected and skilled physician, had acted so coldly. To many, his refusal to treat Charlie, the homeless man, seemed unthinkable. But the truth behind Dr. Pierce's actions was far more complicated than anyone could imagine. It all started years ago, before Dr. Pierce had become the successful doctor people knew today. He had once been a young man, full of ambition and hope, eager to make a difference in the world. But there was one person who had been his guiding light. Charlie. Charlie wasn't always homeless. He had once been a successful entrepreneur, respected in the community, and a mentor to many, including Dr. Pierce. When Dr. Pierce was still in medical school, Charlie had taken him under his wing. He was the kind of person who always had a solution to every problem, always giving advice, always teaching. The young Dr. Pierce had looked up to him as a father figure. But life, as it often does, threw unexpected challenges their way. Charlie's business empire crumbled. Bad investments, poor decisions, and the weight of personal tragedies sent him spiraling. He lost everything: his money, his home, and ultimately, his sense of self-worth. The man who had once been a symbol of strength and wisdom became someone completely different, a shadow of his former self. Dr. Pierce tried to help. He reached out, offered advice, even tried to pull Charlie back from the brink. But Charlie had fallen too far. He refused to accept help, pushing everyone who cared about him away. One fateful night, Charlie hit rock bottom. He was found passed out on the streets, barely alive, with a bottle of alcohol beside him. It was a turning point for Dr. Pierce. He had been there, watching the man he once admired, now nothing more than a broken shell of who he used to be. But what broke Dr. Pierce even more wasn't just the sight of Charlie's ruin. It was his own failure. In that moment, Dr. Pierce couldn't shake the guilt. He blamed himself. He had tried so hard to save Charlie, but in the end, Charlie had chosen his path. It wasn't just about losing a mentor, it was about losing someone who had once taught him the most important lessons of life. Years passed, and Dr. Pierce's career flourished. He built a reputation as a brilliant doctor, rising to the top of his field. But the memories of Charlie, his fall, and his own failure never left him. Every time Dr. Pierce passed someone on the street who resembled Charlie, his stomach would twist with guilt. It was something he couldn't escape. So when Charlie showed up at the hospital that day, Dr. Pierce was faced with a choice. He could have treated him, helped him as he once would have. But he didn't. Because seeing Charlie brought back all the pain, all the guilt. It wasn't just about treating a patient, it was about confronting the past he'd spent years trying to bury. As the story continued to unfold, more details about the homeless man, Charlie, began to surface. The public, initially unaware of his past, now began to piece together the truth. Who was this man? How had he ended up on the streets? Charlie wasn't just any homeless man. He had once been a successful businessman, someone who had it all. His life had been filled with luxury, respect, and admiration. He had been the kind of person people looked up to. Before everything fell apart, Charlie had built an empire. He had a thriving company, a beautiful family, and a future that seemed endless. But then, in the blink of an eye, everything collapsed. A series of bad investments, a few wrong decisions, and the weight of personal loss had torn his world apart. One by one, his company's assets were seized, his home was foreclosed, and his family walked away. He was left with nothing but the streets. But the most shocking part of his story wasn't just his fall from grace, it was who he had once been to Dr. Pierce. Charlie had been Dr. Pierce's mentor, a man who had taught him everything he knew about the world. The lessons he imparted weren't just about business or life, they were about humanity, about understanding others and offering compassion. Dr. Pierce had been a young, eager student, looking for guidance, and Charlie had provided it. He had shaped the person Dr. Pierce became. But when Charlie fell, so did the relationship between them. Dr. Pierce couldn't save him. He couldn't fix the man who had once been his hero, and that hurt more than anything. It was a loss that Dr. Pierce never truly recovered from. Now, years later, Charlie was back. But this time, things were different. The man who had once been a source of strength to Dr. Pierce was now a broken figure, sitting in the waiting room of the hospital, waiting for help. The same man who had given Dr. Pierce a lifetime of advice was now the one in need. What had happened to Charlie? Was he still the man Dr. Pierce had known, or had time and pain completely changed him? As the hours passed, Charlie's condition worsened. He grew weaker, barely able to sit up. His cough was relentless, and his breathing shallow. But despite all the pain, he didn't ask for help again. He simply sat there, eyes staring at the ground, lost in his own thoughts. Meanwhile, Dr. Pierce sat in his office, unable to focus. The room around him was silent, but his mind was far from quiet. He couldn't shake the image of Charlie's face, so familiar, yet so different. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man who had once been his mentor, the one he had failed. And that failure was suffocating him. The guilt had been eating away at him for years, and now, seeing Charlie in that waiting room, he couldn't ignore it anymore. The walls he had built up, the anger he had buried deep inside, everything was breaking down. He couldn't just turn away this time. No matter how painful it would be to face the past, he had to do something. Dr. Pierce stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't allow Charlie to slip away like this. Not again. He found himself walking toward the waiting room, his footsteps slow but determined. He could feel his heart racing in his chest as he approached Charlie. The man barely looked up when Dr. Pierce reached his side. "I'm sorry," Dr. Pierce said quietly, his voice softer than usual. "I shouldn't have done that. You deserve better." Charlie's tired eyes met his, but he didn't say anything. There was no anger, no resentment, just a quiet acceptance. He knew the truth. He knew what had happened between them. But he wasn't going to fight it. Not anymore. Dr. Pierce sat beside him, looking at the worn face of the man who had once been so full of life. There was so much to say, so much to explain, but neither of them spoke. It wasn't about words. It was about the moment, the connection, however brief, that was formed between them. In the end, Pierce didn't have to do anything grand. The simple act of sitting next to Charlie, acknowledging the past, and offering his presence was enough. Charlie wasn't asking for a miracle. He just needed someone to see him for who he was. Someone who had been lost, someone who deserved to be treated with dignity. And in that moment, Dr. Pierce finally understood. The story of Dr. Pierce and Charlie continued to make waves across the city. News outlets picked up on the surprising turn of events, but the public reaction was mixed. While many were shocked by the doctor's initial refusal to help, others understood the complexity of the situation once the full story came to light. Some of the community, especially those who had criticized Dr. Pierce, now saw a different side of him. They began to realize that his decision wasn't just a cold refusal. It was a man struggling with years of guilt and unresolved emotions. Many shared their thoughts on social media, expressing a newfound sympathy for the doctor. "I was quick to judge," one commenter wrote, "but now I see how much pain he's been carrying all this time. We can't always understand what someone is going through." However, not everyone was willing to forgive. Some still believed that a doctor, regardless of their personal struggles, should never refuse to help a patient. The criticism didn't stop, and it wasn't just online. It was in the local cafes, at dinner tables, and in the workplace. People were divided. The homeless population, too, felt a ripple effect from the incident. The story sparked deeper conversations about homelessness, mental health, and the need for compassion. Some activists saw it as an opportunity to push for more resources and better care for those living on the streets. Others reflected on how society often overlooked people like Charlie, assuming their stories didn't matter. As for Dr. Pierce, he quietly went back to his work. The incident had shaken him, but it had also taught him something valuable: the importance of healing, not just others, but himself as well.